I'm Akela. I am currently a lecturer at Georgia State, but in another life, I worked at the High, and I worked on the Cecilia Beaux exhibition. Specifically, was my last project here. And so I'm pretty familiar with the works that are upstairs. Specifically, this one is the one that I'm going to be talking to you about today. We're sort of apparently retooling the Masterpiece of the Month format just a little bit, and so this is kind of a new format for me. These were shorter talks, and now today's going to be a little bit longer, but there will definitely be time for questions at the end. So if you have any thoughts that that come to you as I'm talking about this image, I'd be happy to talk to you about them afterwards. So today I'm going to speak to you about this stunning 1898 portrait of Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes by Cecilia Beaux. This work, I think, is really one of the great surprises of the Cecilia Beaux retrospective upstairs on view in the Wheelam Pavilion right now if you haven't been up to see it. The painting is probably not as well known as many of the other works by Beaux that are up in the exhibition, and that's largely because the painting still remains in the sitter's family. But in spite of that, it's really a masterful image, capturing the grace and intelligence of its subject. It's full of really gorgeous passages of painting, like those beautiful diaphanous sleeves on her gown, and the loose yet coherent brushstrokes that make up these Japanese prints in the background behind her. It is, to my mind, a masterpiece from an artist who painted quite a few pictures that could be labeled as such. However, in this case, I think that Beaux deliberately intended this work to dazzle the viewer, in part because she knew that it would be compared with the portrait of the same sitter that her contemporary John Singer Sargent did just the year before. This, unfortunately, was the lot of even the most successful of women artists in the late 19th century. When the artist William Merritt Chase proclaimed in 1899 that Beaux was not only the greatest living woman artist, but the best that has ever lived, he actually meant it as a very sincere and effusive estimation of her talent as an artist. Today, Chase's gendered language strikes one as unnecessarily limiting and seems almost to belittle Beau's accomplishments. When Chase made that statement about Beaux, the two artists were on the faculty of the Pennsylvania Academy, which is this building you see here, which is still standing in Philadelphia and has a great American art collection, but also was a school and still is an important school training new artists. And in Beau's time, it was of even greater significance. When Beaux accepted a position in 1895 at the Academy, it really broke new ground for this institution, which had never before hired a woman to such a post. By the turn of the century, Cecilia Beaux had become one of the most successful artists of her time, male or female, and yet it really hadn't been easy. When Beaux set out to become an artist, she knew that there would be sacrifices, and she made them. This is a sort of early photograph of Beaux as a young woman. Although she had offers, she never married, knowing full well that she would not be able to be a professional artist and a married woman at the same time. Even artists' wives found that they were expected to give up their brushes to attend to household affairs, as did Susan McDowell, who married the painter Thomas Akins. And Susan McDowell is seen here. She's painting in the Women's Life class at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts before Beaux was teaching. But she was training to be a professional artist in this climate with lots of other women training to do the same thing. And yet Susan McDowell was not able to maintain that profession once she married her husband. McDowell married the primary instructor at the Academy, that is Thomas Akins, who was actually there when Beaux trained as a young woman at the Pennsylvania Academy as well. Beaux claimed, though, that she avoided Akins because of his very forceful personality, and he was known for his very strong insistence on studying from live models, which you see here, which meant nude models, which some young women were particularly squeamish about doing, and Akins ran into lots of trouble on account of these young women artists, and some male artists as well, but most of it revolved around nudity. Beaux instead opted for a mixture of formal schooling and private instruction, studying for a time with Aiken's close friend, William Sartain, who came from New York to offer critiques in the studio that Beaux then shared with her cousin, Emma Leavitt. Beaux began, as many women artists did, painting portraits of children. Porcelain portraits such as this one here. This is on a porcelain plate. It's actually up in the exhibition as well. These sorts of portraits could be quite lucrative, but they were not what Beaux had in mind when she determined to become an artist. After creating some of the finest works in this genre, Beaux made her true professional debut with this painting here from 1885, which is called Les Derniers Jours d'Enfance, which is upstairs as well. And this painting is a portrait of her sister Etta with her firstborn child, her son Harry. And Harry actually went on to become a favorite subject of Beaux. He's seen here as an adult in this 1911 marriage portrait, this wedding portrait of him and his young bride that Beaux did later on in her career. And this also is upstairs. This is called Portraits in Summer. By any measure, Dernier Jour is an important picture. In this work, Beaux really uncannily portrayed an intimate glimpse at the inner life of a child whose relationship to his mother is at the point of delicate transition. The title of the painting, given in French, the translation of that is really The Last Days of Childhood, and you can see that he's no longer a baby. He's kind of at the point where he's about to kind of assert a bit more independence from his mother. The child's believable yet awkward pose suggests the casualness that masks Beau's labor on the painting. She, in fact, orchestrated its every detail, the poses, the costumes, the props, in order to capture what appears to be an informal study of mother and child. Her labor was not in vain, though, for this painting won the Pennsylvania Academy's Mary Smith Prize, which was an award that was given for the best painting by a female resident of Philadelphia. Though the first of her professional honors, the award situated her not as an artist, but as a woman artist, a term that Beaux would graciously resist throughout her career. On the suggestion of a friend, another woman artist, Beaux sent the painting to the Salon in Paris 2 years later, which was a very bold move for any young artist, but particularly one for an artist who had basically just started her career. The painting, very fortunately, was accepted and well placed within the Salon's galleries, which encouraged Beaux to make a trip to Europe the following year to pursue her studies and see what professional opportunities might greet her on the other side of the Atlantic. She arrived in Paris in January 1882, accompanied by her cousin May Whitlock, and this is a photograph of Beaux, who is here on the right side, and her cousin May during their European trip. The two women would not have been permitted to study here at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was the official French school, because this school did not at this point accept women. Instead, they entered one of the better-known private academies, the Académie Julienne, and this is a painting from a few years earlier by another artist showing the women's life class at the Académie Julienne. They stayed at the Académie Julienne and also ended up studying at another similar private school called the Académie Colarossi. Although Beaux enjoyed the opportunity to work in this bohemian environment, she probably didn't actually get very much from it. She was actually a pretty mature artist by this point, having worked up from those porcelain plates to very large-scale compositions like Dernier Jour. And she had actually studied a bit from nude models before, so she was familiar with these sorts of techniques that most artists used in this time period. More fruitful for her, perhaps, during the European trip was a visit that she made to Concarneau, which was an artist colony in France on the Brittany coast. And this is actually a photograph of some of her comrades and her. She's here. It's a somewhat faded photograph, but she's here on the left side with her cousin in the Concarneau colony. This little town, very small village in this time period, was actually a really thriving international artist community at the time that Beaux visited it. And she was particularly heartened by the encouragement and criticism that she received from a fellow American, the artist Alexander Harrison, who is seen in this photograph here, standing sort of behind and between the two women, who was really best known for his paintings of coastal scenes like this, one showing these ocean waves. And he did a whole range of these wave pictures, which are really very beautiful, somewhat limited subject matter, but they're very difficult to accomplish. And so Harrison offered Beaux some advice and encouragement during her visit that helped her professionally. And she responded to the criticism probably with paintings like this, where you see that her palette has lightened. The Dernier Jour painting is kind of dark and brown. Now she's working with a very light outdoor palette. And the subject matter that she's chosen here shows these two Brittany peasants, so it's a local subject. But it is also a type of painting that would have been termed a figure painting. And you'll notice if you go up to the Beaux exhibition, the subtitle of it is An American Figure Painter, which means in this time period when artists were studying the human model so much in these schools, they really wanted to develop pictures that involved the human figure. And figure pictures were something that was a little bit more than a portrait and more substantive than most of the genre paintings of everyday life that had been so popular in previous decades. They often included a kind of vaguely narrative dimension, and this particular painting is called Twilight Confidences, which adds just a little bit of mystery about what these two women are doing. These two women are not identified specifically, so it's not a portrait. It is a bit of a genre subject. But the title gives you some sense that there's some sort of hidden narrative that hasn't been revealed to you. Beaux specialized in such meaningful studies of the human psyche, even in works that appear to be more straightforward portraits like this one. There's a lingering sense of some sort of unrevealed plot line that's at work. This is Sita and Sarita, which sort of shows the intensity that Beaux could achieve in these types of works. It is ostensibly a portrait of yet another of Beau's cousins, and shows this very intelligent woman sort of gazing off into the distance while the viewer is scrutinized by the soft green eyes of the black cat on her shoulder. There's more than meets the eye here, though. It's not a very straightforward image. The sitter is swathed in this virginal white, but she's accompanied by a black cat, an animal that often materialized in paintings of this period as a symbol of female sexuality. What does it all mean? Why the enigmatic title Sita and Sarita instead of merely using the sitter's name, which was the common convention for portraits of the period? Really, the answer is that it's a figure painting. It's one that has more meaning than just a straightforward portrait, but also has a lot of the same qualities that you find in portraiture. And so we come back to the subject of my talk today, which is Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes, who, in addition to my really loving this portrait by Beaux, as I found out, Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes was a really fascinating woman. She was a very accomplished young woman, born to great wealth. Her father, Robert Minturn, was the heir to a considerable New York shipping fortune. Her mother, Susanna Shaw, also came from a New York family. She was the sister, actually, of Robert Gould Shaw, who was the famed commander of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, who died along with many of his African-American troops in the assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, which was obviously the subject of the film Glory and also the subject of the monument that Augustus St. Gaudens made for Boston Common. Like the Shaws, the Minturns were deeply committed to social causes, a tradition that Edith and her husband, Isaac Newton Phelps Stokes, would continue. As a young debutante, Edith Minturn was known for staging tableaux vivants, which were these usually sort of fashionable party forms of entertainment where individuals would sit in these very sustained poses that recreated paintings or literary characters. Edith, however, used her estimable beauty at these events to raise money for charitable causes. It was also in these poses that she drew the attention of artists. And actually, the sculptor Daniel Chester French used her as his model for this very monumental sculpture called the Republic, which still exists, but which was actually designed for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. And it stood at that time in a very prominent position in the Court of Honor and was really the sort of dominant thing in the landscape. This composition was also the basis for a figure that French later designed for the Wisconsin State House. So Edith's face ended up on quite a few works of art. Beaux probably met Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes when she began painting this double portrait of the sitter's in-laws, Mr. and Mrs. Anson Phelps Stokes. There can be a lot of Phelps Stokes in here, so it gets a little complicated. Edith Minturn had married into the Stokes family in 1895 when their eldest son, I.N., as he was known, Isaac Newton, but he went by his initials, became her husband in a ceremony at her mother's summer home in Quebec. The Stokeses were another wealthy New York family with philanthropic interests. Anson Phelps Stokes, who is seen here in the background, inherited a fortune from his family's mining business and added to it with his own banking firm and real estate investments. And yet he also found time for involvement with several political and social reform organizations. The worlds of the Minturns and the Stokeses intersected in New York City, whose society columns show the two families attending cotillions with the city's elite and serving on the organizing committees and boards of numerous charitable institutions. Now, how Beaux came to paint Mr. and Mrs. Anson Phelps Stokes is unclear, but paint them she did. In this somewhat unconventional society picture, the couple appears at leisure in their Madison Avenue home. And flouting the social custom, it's Mrs. Stokes who really dominates the painting. Although some critics admired it for its naturalness and simplicity, others dismissed it as, quote, an unfortunate experiment. This was perhaps due to the fact that Sargent had just exhibited his much-admired portrait of the Stokes' new daughter-in-law with their son I.N. lurking in the background, which is this painting here, which is quite a famous work that I'll talk a little more about shortly. Even recent scholars have seized upon the similarity of the two compositions, which strongly situate the women in the foreground to the disadvantage of their male counterparts. Sargent's composition was, according to I.N. at least, an afterthought. The painting was intended as a wedding gift from a family friend who had actually just commissioned a portrait of the wife of Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes. Traveling in Europe, the young couple met up with Sargent in his London studio in 1897, which is just the year before Beaux was painting both portraits of the Stokes family members. Typical of his practice, Sargent set out about studying Edith in a variety of costumes and initially intended to create a much more formal image of Edith wearing a satin evening gown. He finally decided upon the attire you see here, a skirt, shirtwaist, and jacket, casual dress for a Gilded Age society girl. When Edith came to the studio following a brisk walk from her London apartment, Sargent was delighted by her really jaunty costume and the fresh glow of her cheeks and decided to scrape out all the previous work that he'd done and start anew. At this point, Mrs. Anson Phelps Stokes, the mother here of I.N., asked if Sargent could paint a portrait of her son as a companion piece to give as a gift to her daughter-in-law. Sargent, however, was much too busy with commissions to oblige and said that he couldn't do it and actually suggested that they visit the studio of James McNeill Whistler. But Whistler was much too expensive, so they decided not to pursue that angle. Then, as work progressed on the portrait of Edith, Sargent was dismayed to learn that the Great Dane that he had planned to paint at her side was no longer available. at which point I.N. had the stroke of inspiration that he could stand in the dog's place. And that's how this portrait came to be the sort of odd portrait that it is, in that she is so crisply painted in the foreground, and he's really sort of tucked in the shadows behind her and doesn't quite fit well into the composition. She was actually not supposed to be holding a hat, but she was supposed to have her hand on the head of a Great Dane. It's in this context that Beaux' portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Anson Phelps Stokes, this portrait here of the older couple, has usually been seen, often to the detriment of Beaux. In 1899, the critic Charles Cafin wrote that in contrast to the Sargent, Beaux' painting, quote, grows tiresome with renewed acquaintance. And he was not alone among 19th century writers in his assessment. Even the Metropolitan Museum of Art more recently, in their 1980s collection catalog of the American collection, criticized Beaux' portrait for lacking, quote, the spontaneity and psychological power so evident in the Sargent work, unquote. Yes, there are similarities, and it's quite likely that Beaux knew about the Sargent picture when she painted the elder Stokes. Yet there's a lot that we don't know about Beaux' commission. For example, did the sitters request that the double portrait be a kind of companion piece to the Sargent painting? Very likely. The other thing that might be entirely possible is that, much like Sargent's painting had started out, that Beaux may have intended this work to be a portrait only of Mrs. Stokes and then thought about adding her husband later. This is possibly suggested by an effusive letter that I.N. wrote to Beaux praising the painting, which he referred to only as, quote, my mother's portrait, with no mention of the father. In any case, the painting was exhibited in 1899 at the Pennsylvania Academy, where Sargent's portrait of Mr. and Mrs. I.N. Phelps Stokes also hung, making the comparison between the two works almost compulsory. And this is an exhibition shot of the 1899 exhibition, and this is the Beaux Anson Phelps Stokes portrait, and here's the Sargent I.N. Phelps Stokes portrait. So they're hung quite close to one another in a position where you could easily compare the two if you wanted to stand in this corner and look back and forth. Beaux took this rivalry, at least in the case of Sargent, with good humor. She really valued his work, and on a visit to London in 1896, 2 years before she painted the Phelps Stokeses, she made a study of the Sargent pictures that she saw there, and London, being the location of Sargent's studio, had quite a number of Sargent pictures. She also held the man in very high esteem, which is clear from this photograph here showing Sargent painting Mrs. Fisk Warren and her daughter, which comes from Cecilia Beaux' personal papers, which is a memento of the collegial relationship that the two had. This is a pretty common photo of Sargent, but one that Beaux kept and hung on to. And yet it must have really grated on her to always be compared and to always be ranked as a woman artist, almost, but not quite as good as Sargent by dint of her gender. And this doesn't just apply to the Stokes portraits. Beaux was always compared to Sargent. Fortunately, Beaux' portrait of Edith was not exhibited until 1902, and thus it escaped the very direct comparisons to Sargent's earlier picture of the same sitter. In fact, in the few exhibitions to which Beaux' portrait was lent, critics were generally unwavering in their praise and made no mention of Beaux' male contemporary, which is actually odd, given that Sargent really lurks around the margins of this picture. Beaux, fully conscious that Sargent had painted the same sitter, and most likely aware of how he painted her, decided to throw down the gauntlet and pull out all the stops. The painting is soulful and lushly painted, full of rich textures and well-thought-out contrasts. She was trying to out-Sargent Sargent. And here I must apologize for comparing the two artists, but I think that Beaux was ardently trying to prove what some critics believed women artists incapable of, by showing that she could paint like a man, and not just any man, but the man to whom she was so often compared. To be clear, Beaux' portrait really owes nothing to Sargent's directly. In many ways, it's just a straightforward portrait. That is, a likeness in both the physical and psychological senses. Sargent's very striking image is a clever depiction of a fresh American girl, really a type that was well known in the international community. Beaux instead captures Edith in all her complexity. Foremost, there is the superficial. Edith is a beautiful woman, beautifully attired and presented. But there's also a serenity and depth to her depiction that adds weight to this merely physical assessment of her virtues. And there's that one finger in the book that keeps her place, which really kind of alludes to the intellectual gifts of this woman. To me, the image recalls the impression of Edith, recorded by Reverend William Rainsford, who officiated at her wedding. He said, "I have known one or two women as beautiful, one or two women as interesting, one or two women as spiritual, but for the combination of the three, I've never known her equal." More than just a pretty package, though, Edith Minturn was a society girl who also worried about the poor, particularly poor children. And her major charitable cause was the kindergarten movement. Kindergartens were not widespread in the Gilded Age and frequently required the support of wealthy patronesses to fund them. Edith became a staunch advocate for the expansion of kindergartens, particularly in the tenement neighborhoods of the Lower East Side of New York. Here, her interests actually very beautifully dovetailed with her husband's, because I.N. studied architecture at the École des Beaux-Arts in France and dedicated himself to building better housing for the poor and made a real specialty of tenement housing. He actually took his work so seriously that on occasion he would dress in rags and smear his face with charcoal in order to check himself into the city's ramshackle flop houses. He wanted to know who he was building for and what conditions they endured. I.N. Phelps Stokes built better tenement housing and later reformed the housing laws to ensure that all tenement houses would be built so. In the process of looking into the family history and researching this couple, I've grown quite attached to them, as you might tell. But I think the most touching thing that struck me in reading about them is really how their relationship ended. During the 1930s, Edith suffered a series of strokes that left her paralyzed and speechless, and I.N. dedicated himself to her care. And according to the family, he would read to her and tell her jokes on the days that he didn't wheel her through Central Park, never receiving any inkling that she even heard him. This went on for 4.5 years until Edith died in 1937, and the couple were buried actually together in St. Paul's Chapel on the campus of Columbia University, which is a building actually that I.N. designed. Following Edith's death, I.N., who had been suffering from financial difficulties for some time, left his palatial apartment on Fifth Avenue, which was also in a building that he designed, to move into a small 2-bedroom apartment, and he ended up taking meals at a local diner. He had hung on to his Fifth Avenue apartment so that Edith would have a place to live, a real home. Edith Minturn Phelps Stokes bequeathed Sargent's portrait to the Metropolitan Museum of Art on her death, where it remains today. In thinking about the frequent Beaux and Sargent comparisons, I've often wondered what the family must have thought of the two pictures. Given his devotion to Edith, I have to believe that for I.N., it was Beau's picture that had the stronger appeal. I say this not just because I'm attached to this painting, but because it was the one that he couldn't let go. Living in a 2-room apartment and in need of cash, he never sold Beau's likeness of his beloved wife. Thank you. Thanks.
We'll now take questions from the audience. I will ask that you raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. We do film these lectures for the Atlanta Forum Network, which is in alliance with the public broadcasting system, and they post these lectures to a website called www.atlantaforumnetwork.com. So if anyone has any questions, please don't be afraid to speak into the microphone. Are there any questions?
Did you mention how old she was when she died?
I think she was 69.
Did you have a question? Okay.
And he outlived her by about a decade. He actually, oddly enough, over the death of his wife, became very close friends with New York City's flamboyant mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, who is not a natural pairing for a, sort of New York blue blood to end up rubbing shoulders with Fiorello LaGuardia. But LaGuardia had taken care of his ill wife, and the two, who had not gotten along very well prior to that, sort of bonded over this. Yeah.
What was the cause of the financial distress that they had at the end of their lives?
Actually, one major part of it was the Great Depression. But the other thing that IN did, which he's really best known for today more than his architecture, is that he wrote this massive 6-volume history of the city of New York. And he did it in a fairly short period of time, but it absorbed tremendous resources. And he spent just an incredible amount of money on these volumes, which are still incredibly useful today. They document the city's history going back to the Dutch. And actually, I think he starts his chronology in 516. Not 1516, but 516. So he was incredibly thorough and devoted to this. But he bought up all of these maps and old documents in New York, and that was a lot of where his funds went to. And then his real estate holdings really suffered reverses during the Depression. He actually had a job, too. He ended up becoming the chairman of the city's Municipal Art Council. And so he had to kind of work. And in that position, he actually oversaw the WPA projects in the city.
There's one portrait of a gentleman in a white suit in the gallery, and I think there was something about the fact that he had pursued Cecilia, but she had rejected him, and he ended up marrying Etta, her older sister.
Yes.
Do you know anything about that and why she?
Yeah, that was Henry Drinker, who became the father of Harry, the little boy in that early portrait. And Beaux just steadfastly refused to marry, and it really was a career killer for a woman in the 1880s, 1890s to have gotten married. It meant that you had to take care of the household, and there was no doing anything else. And had she married Henry Drinker, she wouldn't have become a painter. And that was not the only marriage offer that she had, but she also she often, even though she didn't marry, she surrounded herself with very young, attractive men, even into her very late years. And they were often quite devoted to her.
I didn't hear any mention of children. Did they have any children?
They actually did not have children on their own, but they did adopt a young girl. And that daughter was the major heir to the estate, and it was through her family line that the painting has stayed in the family. And it is actually currently owned by their grandson.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you all for coming in this evening, and thank you, Akela, for being here tonight.
Thank you, Ashley.